Okay, good morning, everyone. Nice and early on a Sunday morning. We are here at the Faculty of Arts, Chulalongkorn University, and we are very excited to kick off our workshop on revisiting Pan-Asianism and decolonization attempts in the Transwar. I think this is a rather complex kind of title here, and it's the idea is that we want to explore this period of decolonization in Asia a bit wider. We wonder if decolonization might be explored beyond the Cold War period. Perhaps it could be extended all the way to the early 20th century. There started to be nationalist movements, nationalist aspirations across various parts of Asia from even before the Second World War. So perhaps we can expand our understanding of this decolonization era beyond just what we usually think of as the post-Second World War era. And this is related to another major theme in Asia, which is Pan-Asianism, which is something that came out from the earliest decade of the 20th century and actually has quite an influence on the early rise of nationalist movements in many areas in Asia as well. Pan-Asianism has sort of fallen into tough times though. I mean, during the Second World War with Japan's expansionism, invading China and Southeast Asia and such, Pan-Asianism has sort of like been pushed to the wayside quite a bit in the post-Second World War period. I would say largely due to the influence of US historiography of the Second World War. So we were wondering if revisiting Pan-Asianism might allow us to understand decolonization a bit better. And so we've come together today, 9 papers, 10 papers, quite a few, to try and understand that. And I haven't introduced myself, right? I'm Wasanawong Sarawat. I'm from the History Department, Chulalongkorn University. And our event today, Revisiting Pan-Asianism and Decolonization Attempts of the Transwar era, has been generously supported by Manusaya Journal of Humanities, which is the Faculty of Arts, Chulalongkorn University's main international journal. And of course, we've also received the kind support of the Faculty of Arts History Department. And we actually have a co-host today, Dr. David Malitz, who will present later. Unfortunately, he's not feeling very well this morning, so he's only going to be with us online for the morning, at least, from the German Institute for Japanese Studies in Tokyo. And we hope that we are going to have a very fruitful workshop today, and the proceedings from this workshop hopefully would eventually become a special issue for Manusaya Journal of Humanities. And this morning, I feel very fortunate that we have a very special keynote speaker for our event, Professor Arjun Subrahmanyan from Murdoch University. I had the privilege of reviewing his book, Amnesia, A History of Democratic Idealism in Modern Thailand earlier, and I felt that this is just the kind of story that we want to revisit, and might would probably bring a lot of what I want to investigate, that we all want to investigate in this workshop together in his keynote speech. And also I have a hidden agenda here as well. This year, 2022, is actually the 90th anniversary of the Siamese Revolution of 1932. And of course, Amnesia, A History of Democratic Idealism in Modern Thailand is very much about the history of Panarasadon and the 1932 revolution. And I think that there is quite a bit that needs revisiting on this history of the Thai revolution and what has become of it. And I'm very much looking forward to Dr. Subrahmanyan's presentation today. So without further ado, I will hand the floor over to Dr. Subrahmanyan on his keynote address titled Liberating Thai History, the Thai Past in an Asian Century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arjun, for the gracious introduction. Just to confirm, can everyone hear me okay in the wider world?
Yes, good morning. We can hear you.
Good, thank you. In a newspaper article published in 1927, a Bangkok journalist discussed the absolute monarchy's anachronism. He wrote that it was time to get away from absolute monarchy and claimed that in any case, there was nothing particularly Thai or special, unique to Thai about an absolute monarchy. 5 years later, in their manifesto issued on the day that they staged an overthrow of the absolute monarchy, the People's Party, the Keynote Address, justified their move against the king on much the same grounds, that no other absolute monarchy still existed in the world, and that the institution blocked progress and freedom. These two pieces of writing, one an op-ed and one a political broadside on the establishment, appeared before and after the Great Depression that brought to a head a crisis of faith in the Thai government. Public criticism of the establishment at the time was acute and sprang not only from the government's difficulty in meeting the challenges of economic crisis, but also from a longer-term social divide between the haves and the have-nots, the city and the country, the protected and the exposed, that ran right through the 40 years of the absolute monarchy. The criticisms I just outlined echoed much of the anti-colonial rumblings from neighboring Southeast Asian states at the same time, where populations lived under some form of Western colonialism. Not only did literate society across the region speak in similar ways about their community's burdens, they linked their problems to universal patterns across the global political economy. The idea that literate society in the colonized world identified their crises as universal in scope, and hence part of who they actually were was a universal phenomena, is an obvious point, or it should be an obvious point to make in understanding colonial and 20th century history. But in Thailand, astoundingly, after 170 years or so of a globalized economy, going back to the Bowring Treaty of the 1850s, it is frequently not believed that the country's path to modernity bears much resemblance to anyone else's. My colleagues here today are well familiar with the elements of what you may call a standard narrative of Thai history. In a nutshell, much of the standard narrative revolves around belief that very old national traits of tolerance, assimilation, and the love of freedom, all allowed to persist and flourish because of an unbroken power of monarchy show the Thai people's moral superiority when compared to their neighbors. The irony, or one of the ironies of this view, is that it emerged as a reaction against the weakness of the modern state, and especially from the turn of the 20th century crises that shook the Thai elite. In particular, French aggression in the 1890s gave the king at the time, King Chula, a near nervous breakdown. And being a very intelligent and a very capable man, he undoubtedly realized well what later generations may forget, that making a modern independent state in the colonial world required some good geographical luck, some cultural alchemy, and a valuable export economy. His son Prachatipo, who lost his absolute power to the People's Party and their revolution in 1932, argued that what Chulalongkorn accomplished was the real revolution in Thai history. During the Cold War heyday of area studies across Southeast Asia, many scholars tried to adopt the vantage point of native observers of a Western-dominated world. This is true of scholars from both the left and the right, politically speaking. Many of us know, and for Farang especially, studied what for a long time was the standard English textbook on Thai history, David Wyatt's A Brief History of Thailand. The book came out in 1982 and reflected a mature scholar's work over the prior decade and a half, and his viewpoint that was strongly echoing a Thai nationalist history. In Wyatt's view, the Thai kings made the country's history. They acted with moral righteousness of their own free will, although in circumstances that were imposed on them. While Thailand may have been forced to respond to the West in this view, the leaders did so freely. From the other end of the political spectrum, a more Marxist-inspired spectrum, and also beginning within area studies and during the same period in the Cold War, emerged studies that saw the Thai case as parallel to colonialism, not to, say, somewhere like Japan. Semi-colonialism as a term was first used in Thailand to buttress or support Marxist arguments that Thailand was not unique and was in fact a part of a universal revolutionary history. The use of semi-colonialism in this way began in the 1950s. Studies that have highlighted Thailand or Siam's colonial-like condition have had a major impact within Thai critical studies. In the critical tradition, Thailand in the age of European empires was exposed to exactly the same forces of the new international political economy as all of its neighbors, and the results were predictably fairly similar to what happened in neighbors exposed to the world system. Since at least studies from the 1970s, I'm thinking of Ben Anderson in English or Chakteep Natsupa and People in Political Economy, critical scholars have outlined the main features of what is common in this view about Thailand to the neighbors. Very limited fiscal independence, limited industrial development, the primacy of farm exports, borders that were imposed on the country from the outside, the influence of foreign advisors, limited infrastructure, and limited education for most people. Still, as Peter Jackson has noted, producing mountains of empirical data and finally detailed studies of Thailand's semi-colonial past has not broken down the claims of Thai uniqueness. Indeed, if anything, sometimes it has reinforced them. In much of the use of ideas like semi-colonial or later versions of a semi-colonial approach that would use newer words like hybrid or a dual society, scholars always assert a local autonomy within a Western-dominated world. What is more important in understanding this dual or hybrid society is debatable. Is it external pressure? Is that the main driver? Or is it an internal initiative? This is still a problem that scholars discuss. In the former view that it is external factors that are more important, reference to international economy or international law take precedence. For in both cases, Thailand looks like a colony when it's viewed from that perspective. In the latter view, from a perspective that adopts or stresses more the internal initiative of the Thai elite, especially, the control or the politics of the Thai state internally in relation to a subject population or subject populations, more than one, is the central issue. And here, the state does appear independent. It's not subordinate to an international system. It works from its own initiative. In both views, however, applying some notion of the critical tradition or notions from the critical tradition, like semi-coloniality or newer versions of hybrid political economy or a hybrid state, can temper or help us to understand, I think, the history better. For the former view, that it's the international dimension that's most important, using a notion of hybridity leaves open room for ambiguity that undermines the claims of Westernization or Western power as running, if you like, all the way down through Thai society. For the latter view, that domestic initiative is more important, this opens the space to explain how the country, while it may be similar in many ways to neighboring colonialisms, is nonetheless different when compared to the neighboring countries. What to call this form of society, semi-something, hybrid something, dual something, or any type of colony, for that matter, leads us to the next question that I'd like to raise, and this concerns a rupture or a break, introducing something new with whatever that society was and how it does really change. Especially here, I'm speaking in relation to revolutions or to popular resistance movements. One way to approach this idea of novelty or newness is through the historical comparison of that thing, the thing meaning a popular movement, a revolution, an important political change, to similar prior events. Often in the colonial case, this meant prior events that had happened in Europe, but this is doesn't always have to be what we're discussing. How do we understand what may be genuinely new about something? Like, for example, what I was interested in, the 1932 revolution, when it closely resembles in many forms something that has already happened somewhere else. This topic was of concern, has been of concern in the wider global South, especially to me in somewhere like India and the subaltern studies scholarly movements. One scholar, for example, Dipesh Chakrabarty, had argued that novelty or newness in politics enters the world through displacing something else, something that had already happened, which it resembled, but which it was not exactly just a pale copy of. The repetition of at least the form of something that had already happened somewhere else has the ability or the power to transgress or to marginalize what happened or what came before. Another way to address this issue of newness or novelty is through literally the biological birth of new people. All of us are unique, born into a world, and we all are brand new beginnings in a sense. In the time of the same time period that I discuss in the Amnesia book, the 1920s, 1930s, 40s, in Europe, Karl Mannheim, a sociologist, posited the theory of a generation as a group with a common identity born of a shared experience. In Mannheim's explanation, the most famous generation that had a common experience was the generation that served in the trenches of Europe in World War I, the front generation. After the war, this generation split apart and came into conflict with each other based on their differing access to power and the differing cultural contexts in which they grew up. So they had a founding experience that was common in the trenches of the war, but thereafter their experience led them down different paths. The European inferno that was the First World War was not the only source of a common generational experience at the time, nor the only source of a common feeling. In the United States, in the 20s and 30s, a new consumer economy was taking shape, and this changed American life at the same time. In America, the common experience was not one of disaster, as it had been in Europe, or loss. In America, the new feeling was more optimistic, a common culture founded on, for example, university life, which became normal for the first time for young people, or team sports. Sounds a bit flippant, but it was an important part of how American generational life changed popular culture. And consumerism also changed America. In Southeast Asia, the commonality was the experience, I would offer, the experience of life in the age of high imperialism of the late 19th, early 20th century. 2 points in the Southeast Asian experience are worth commenting upon. The first is that the common political economy, which I discussed a bit and tried to reinsert the Thai case into a bigger political economy that spanned the region, produced a similar feeling of what one scholar of Indonesia called an age in motion. And second, the commonality was a public feeling that fed on an idea that the future would be better than the past. These processes of how do we discuss novelty, how is novelty produced in a world where many prior political movements or revolts had already pioneered, if you like, ways to do something new. For example, repetition as a displacement of something, not just a pale copy. And the novel feeling, whether it was pessimistic in the case of Europe or more optimistic in the case of Southeast Asia, of a new generation and its experience are interrelated. Always in our century at least, in the early 20th century, also is the prevalence of a hybrid or mixed political culture that challenged Western imperialism. Hybridity in scholarship, especially post-colonial scholarship, which perhaps has not gained that much traction in Thai studies because it's usually associated with post-colonialism. And if, like in much of the Thai culture, if you think, well, we were never colonized, then what's there to discuss about post-colonialism? We don't have post-colonialism because we never had colonialism to begin with. This is a bit of a problem. But nonetheless, hybridity in scholarship, even if it came from post-colonialism, I think it's applicable to a degree to the Thai case, and especially its reference to a strategy or a technique of resistance that empowers people beneath an elite and uses aspects of foreign culture, Westernism, Westernization, Japanese culture, whatever it is, as a way to push back or to challenge the elite culture or dominant culture of the time. In my case, not my personal case, but the case of the 1932 revolution, the Siamese political culture is strongly in evidence in this regard, where the promoters, the Pukokan of the 1932 revolution, used Westernism as a measure of what they regarded as the backwardness of the absolute monarchy. Where outsiders to the 1932 revolution used the same or similar Western assimilated ideas to argue against not only the prior system of the kings, but also against the People's Party themselves, and to argue against the limits that the People's Party imposed on the revolution that they began. In addition to some of these ways to approach political change, displacement or a hybrid political culture or a common experience as pushing things forward, a common generation that has a different view on the world. Another way is through collective experience in a different way, collective experience used in a slightly different way than what I used above with a generational topic. Here, I'm very much influenced and really love the work of a prior generation of British Marxists who wrote in the 1960s and 1970s. Now today, it might seem extremely old-fashioned to refer to this older scholarship, but to me, it still resonates very strongly. British Marxists like Edward Thompson or Raymond Williams, Eric Hobsbawm, Douglas Hay, used collective experience as a vital force in the story of the have-nots or the dispossessed. To them, experience had an immediacy, had a truthfulness that they expressed very vividly in their histories. If you think of a book like E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, the feeling of the times comes across very strongly. This meant, or expressed this approach, experience was not merely common sense or a low level or instinctive understanding of something that needed scientific understanding to make it intelligible. Experience in this approach of poverty, of violence, of prejudice, created an ethical community on its own. Hence here, a common aim, whatever the aim was, a political utopia or a socialist future or a community at the local level that broke away from the status quo, whatever it was, joined raw experience with some notion of a political plan or a political project. These reflections on agency in history or experience in history are not unique to the left. I'm very much inspired by left-wing writings on experience, but there are many others from a much different political approach that also have always been influential. Much of the same topic of experience has been approached from a completely opposite political spectrum or cultural spectrum of conservatism. In this vein, on the right, a range of defenses of tradition have similarly stressed the emotion or the rhetorical aspects of experience as well. Unlike the left, however, which have seen these ones on the right, have seen experience as producing a common outlook or aspiration of people, but based upon an acceptance of what has already taken place, an acceptance of tradition, and acceptance of social hierarchy. Inevitably, in this view, which has run the gamut from Edmund Burke's famous Reflections on the Revolution in France, a Whig history or Tory history written in the early 19th century, to something which our Thai friends would know, I think right away, Chulalongkorn's reaction in 1932 against the People's Party itself in his writing, I think the Thai title was Yang Rai Sing Ti, Yang Rai No, Sing Ti Rao Ja Liek Wa Sivalai. It condemns, Chulalongkorn condemned, as did Edmund Burke before him, a generational reaction against traditional politics on the grounds that the reaction was too emotional, it was unoriginal, and it was not really aware of the power, the positive power of tradition. Here, just to sum up, I'm a bit conscious of time. I can give a historical case that uses the 1932 revolution as a way to integrate some of the themes I've been speaking with above in a more concrete way. This was a time, the 1932 revolution, when a young generation experienced and made a new beginning in Thai history, which combined an excitement with or for Western-derived ideas with an awareness that they would meet or encounter a resistance or a reaction, and that in order to overcome the reaction and in order to push forward what they hoped to realize, they had to localize or make Thai their dramatic plans for the future. In my book, Amnesia, I tried to argue that two groups made the revolution together. It was not just insiders from the establishment, not just the People's Party, but also outsiders to the system. And I offered this as a counter to a very long established view that it was only bureaucratic people that made the revolution. It also, I argue, against the view, this is more of a view that is anti-People's Party from the conservative reaction that came after the war, and I'm happy to discuss this more with the colleagues if it's of interest. I'm against the view that the Kanat Ratsadon and the people that were inspired by them were just really copies of a copy, if you like. They were misfits from within a system. They tried to break into an establishment system, but could not. And that in any case, they belonged to a world that was copying the West in all ways through a bureaucratic path to modernity. But there was nothing new about this in the conservative condemnation. They were just sort of aping or mimicking something which had already happened somewhere else. And it wasn't going to work here because Thailand was not somewhere else. Thailand was a new, unique country of its own. In my book, insiders and outsiders, while they might have had differing access to power, both were raised under the modernizing state of the end of the absolute monarchy in a Western colonial world. Both groups were very, in my view, idealistic. Idealism, not as a pejorative or a critical word, that they were just dreamers, as naive people, but idealism in the sense that they used idealism as a way to project a fairer society or to want a fairer society, and used that as a way to understand or to judge conduct today in the here and now. In my approach to 1932, much of the events of the subsequent 20 or so years was a struggle for moral and intellectual leadership of this new thing which was emerging, this new constitutional system. And always the struggle was pitched on a moral high ground where ideas used were always a marriage of Western-derived ideas and Asian or Eastern-derived or Thai-derived ideas to try and create a new type of Thainess that undermined the old elite's claim that it was only a very small minority that had the right to speak for the nation. To just give a few examples of what I'm discussing, after the revolution, labor organizers and a labor movement emerged that spoke on behalf of a largely anonymous or forgotten Chinese immigrant population. Chinese immigrants who, as one newspaper at the time said, well, it's not so much that people forgot about them. People never knew who they were in the first place, and no one, frankly, really cared because they were poor and they weren't Thai people. Arjun has written a very interesting book about the role of Chineseness, part of the book about role of Chineseness in modern Thai identity and modernity. And I was inspired very much by that when I was thinking about this labor movement. The Chinese aspect is very interesting, but the labor leadership also drew inspiration from and spoke to a British socialist movement and British Labour Party politics that they read about in the newspapers of the time. As other examples, also from within the labor movement, many Thai Chinese labor leaders of the time came from very hardworking families of lower middle class origin, you might say petty bourgeois origin, They were very ambitious, not for money or fame necessarily, but to make something of themselves. But they found that their path to a better life was blocked by racism of the People's Party, of the Khanar Ratsadon itself. Many of these younger Thai Chinese politicians or aspiring politicians were self-taught people. One of them learned about the world from reading materials that many of the patrons to his father's opium den would bring with them into the den. He read their books and their magazines that these men brought to the opium club as they, the opium users, whiled away their time in sort of a happy, hazy numbness. While they were happy and hazily numb, this young man read the books and pamphlets and magazines they brought, and he learned about the world from them. He and others became leaders of a World War II labor organization that drew inspiration from what the People's Party was trying to attempt, but also drew experience and inspiration from the Kuomintang, from Karl Marx, from the novelist Lu Xun, from the Chinese Communist Party, and also from the Vietnamese communists in neighboring Southeast Asia. The Thai movement that took shape as part of the decolonizing wave of the 1940s, as just identifying one decade amongst others that surrounded it, was part of a universal demand for equal rights and social justice of those times. But it had the benefit, the Thai movement, of emerging in a country that it did not experience war directly. Many left-wing historians have seen the absence of a Western colonial regime, and hence the absence of a mass nationalist movement here, as obstructing or hurting rather than helping pave the way for a more modern society. As nostalgia for something that never was, or lament for a series of potential turning points in Thai history where the Thai history seemed to fail to turn, 1932, 1946, perhaps 1973, 1997, the Thai left's melancholia can gain some sympathy from its fellow travelers, people that are sympathetic to it. But most historians who are also adults could not possibly, I don't think, demand that blood had to be sacrificed in order to purify the society or to make the society more modern. Many of you here today who research this crucial period in world history have studied events and people that we'll hear about in today's workshop that were all consuming events. They consumed and destroyed what they promised to build. Enzo Traverso, in a recent book on revolutions in world history, wrote that revolutions are history breathing in and breathing out. In the Thai case, perhaps the breath is very fine and slow because of the absence of a very violent history. Fine and slow breathing, like maybe the breath of a monk in a deep meditative trance. For many of you, however, listening and who we will speak today, you would probably describe the revolutionary periods that you are presenting as marked by a ragged and exhausted gasp of fallen soldiers or people that have really fallen under the weight or been collapsed or destroyed by the weight of history. Hannah Arendt, in a book she wrote on revolutions many years ago, described new beginnings as always painful, as always wrenching, or as always violent. The Thai case in the 1932 revolution, there was some violence, but nowhere near what the rest of the world experienced in its revolutions. And today, I look forward to listening to comparisons. I look forward to hearing about the pathos of revolutions in Asia, their costs, as well as what I began my talk today with, which was not violence, but the universalism and the cosmopolitanism of all societies that were in motion during the long 20th century. Okay, Thanks very much for listening. I think I will stop there. Thank you. I think Ajahn Wasana is out dealing with something. I hope she wasn't so upset with what I said that she left and she's not coming back. I don't think that's the case. So perhaps, I'm not sure what Ajahn plan was, but if anyone immediately wanted to ask a question, you certainly can. Or if you don't mind awkward silence, we can wait for Ajahn Wasana to return. It's certainly up to you. Thank you very much for your time. We have a question. How do I, where am I? Where, can you help me, Lo? What am I looking at? Ah.
I think the problem is that you added earlier than she planned. That's why she probably thought she had.
Oh, I thought she told me 9:45 or something. Oh, that's okay. Okay. Andy Gleo.
Arjun, yeah.
Moderation coup. That's okay. I can do that.
One more.
Maya. Click in here.
Yeah, you admit.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So we are in very good time. So we will take. We actually still have some time.
I thought you wanted me to stop at
9:45, yes.
So I said before you came, if someone has questions, they can ask, I'm happy.
Yeah.
Or if people want just to have a drink of water or wait for the next coffee
Okay.
or something, it's
So
up to
there-
you, Ajahn, whatever you.
There was no questions for you?
Not that I don't think so,
Okay.
but maybe later or.
Yes.
Oh, good.นี่ต้องปิดใช่ไหม
ปิดได้ไหมครับ
เปิดไมค์ครับ
โอเค
I'm not sure which word you use. Now something like insider and outsider, those who cause the change. Can you elaborate a little bit more? Insiders and what type popular enterprises over those outsiders, like which group from how many groups of people?
Very good question. Thank you. I shortened the explanation because I wanted to keep time, but it's a very good question. In my understanding, insiders and outsiders together made the 1932 revolution in the period after the revolution. And insiders were primarily people from the bureaucracy itself, from both the military and from the civilian. And you can think of the conventional or general approach, which is Pibun and Song Suradit and people like that on one side, and then Pridi and his Ponlaruan on the other side. That's probably the easiest way. But also the insiders were some, always men, unfortunately, maybe, from the old regime who helped the new regime, like Japaya Tamasak Muntri, or people like that who served in the new regime as well, and were sympathetic to constitution. Okay, so that's the insiders group. The insiders were very jealous of their power and also worried about the reaction from the old regime. So they became more conservative. Outsiders were people from sometimes lower bureaucracy levels, but much different than the insiders who were more privileged. Outsiders came from the provinces. They were often school teachers, Buddhist monks who mobilized, people who worked in newspapers, labor leaders like Tawat Ritide and people like that. And they were very inspired by Kanat Rasadon's idea, but they felt frustrated that Kanat Rasadon did not open the door further to a more participatory revolution. So they constantly pushed the Kanat Rasadon to expand things, but Kanat Rasadon, it's complicated because Kanat Rasadon was not just one thing, as you know. Kanat Rasadon was not willing to expand because they were worried about their own position within the losing power altogether, they worried, perhaps. Okay, so that's the very general breakdown of the two groups. But they, sorry, just quickly, one other thing. It's not, there was overlap, and outsiders knew Kanat Rasadon people. Kanat Rasadon people knew outsiders that sometimes they worked with. So it's not just a complete anti-feeling or opposition, but in general, I think it's true that the outsiders wanted more than the insiders were willing to give them, if you understand what I mean. Thank you. Good question.
Thank you very much. Actually, I have a question as
well.
How would you, is it possible, I mean, if you're going to put this in the context, if you're going to put the Siamese Revolution of 1932 in the context of decolonization, because you did mention that, like, you know, this standard narrative that Thailand was never colonized, and then people just dismiss decolonization, that we don't have that because we were never colonized. So as if to suggest that actually we did have a colonial experience. So how is it possible to frame this as a decolonizing moment and as a decolonizing project?
Arjun, it's a very compelling question. And in my book, I don't really do what Arjun is asking, to see this as post-colonial or a anti-colonial movement. I don't use those terms, but what Arjun is suggesting is very interesting. And to critics of the standard narrative, or to critics of conservative nationalism, the Thai absolutist state functioned as a colonial regime of its own that imposed itself on parts of the country that were not really Siamese or not Thai. The far south, the Muslims, or the northeast, or taking away power from the old lords in northern Thailand, that all of this was colonialism. So when 1932 came, this was anti that approach. And you can, to my knowledge, no one yet has developed that idea that 1932 was anti-colonial in that sense. And I think that this could be sort of the chapter 2 of a story of 1932. Someone else, they could not say, well, you, Arjun, you got it all wrong. They maybe wouldn't say that, but they would say, well, there's something else going on, which is changing what the imagination of what Thailand could become, would become. The reason, part of the reason I don't really do it is, to me, the Keynote Address was not a post-colonial regime, but a strengthener. Even though they were very idealistic, they were a strengthener, this is an old idea as well, of the state that was already there, that they didn't demolish the old state, they changed it, but they strengthened a lot of the bureaucratic tendency it already had. Now, if you want to make it more complicated, scholars who write about, this is old idea as well, going back to de Tocqueville, who wrote about the revolution in France. He said, well, after the revolution in France, there wasn't a revolution. What was changing was already changing before under the ancien regime. And the revolution just made the old state much, much stronger than it was before. People would say that about India, that the Indian National Congress movement, independent India, was not radically different than the British colonial state. It just made the British colonial state much more powerful, but the British were gone. So this is a bit of a complexity to the idea that what do you really mean by post-colonial? And there, I think what I was suggesting, for example, Peter Jackson, who's written a lot, Tong Chai, many people, about where does Thailand fit in this colonial world? They say, well, maybe this idea that of hybrid or joining or merger of what was there before with what was new, with what was Western, with what was Asian, is a way to get around the problem of there was this wall that came down between colony and post-colony and everything was different. You could say, well, no, there was continuity, but the continuity does not mean that nothing changed. Because as I tried to write in the book, and I'm sure as Ajahn Wasana believes, 1932 changed much about the country. So my answer maybe is a bit disappointing. I don't say clearly, yes, post-colonial, or no, not post-colonial. I think maybe there's more work to be done to understand what's happening.
No, actually, it's very. I am very glad that we have Professor Subrahmanyan as our keynote speaker, indeed, because the papers that will be presented today, throughout today, we have issues of, the empire continuing even after independence. We have some papers from the Philippines that talk about that quite clearly. We see a lot of like overlapping of the ancien regime and the revolutionary regime, and this idea that the 20th century is not just like forever broken into half to like pre-World War II and post-World War II. There's quite a bit that overlaps, and I think we see that very nicely in your presentation, and also in the book. One thing I really liked about the book was that you were actually quite critical of Keynote Address as well, because usually we have like the pro and the against, right? And like people who like Keynote Address, it's like Keynote Address can do nothing wrong, right? They're all great, right? And the people who hate them, it's like they did nothing good at all, right? But I was very interested in that you actually accorded quite a bit of space to like all the people who were purged by Keynote Address. I mean, I work fundamentally on modern Chinese history, so it's the purging is a very normal occurrence in modern Chinese history, but you don't really hear that term that much in modern Thai history. And so I feel like it was a very well-rounded presentation of the story.
I'm glad it's useful.
Yes, and also this a very good bridge into the rest of today's events in the presentations that we would have. We still have 4 panels today on with 9 presentations on issues of decolonization and Pan-Asianism, a lot of which Professor Subrahmanyan has mentioned, talked about a bit in this morning's opening session, which is, I think, as all of you would probably agree, has been very exciting and eye-opening. So at this point, I think we are, unless anyone has a last minute question. Okay, then we're probably ready for coffee. And we will be back at 10:15 for the first panel. And so I will stop the recording for now. And everyone at home on Zoom, you would need to come in to the next Zoom session, if that's okay. So see you in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.